We've all heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, and other times just unpleasant. But have you ever paid attention to the common things that are being said? It usually goes something like, "How would you like it if someone did that to you? Why don't you leave him alone? He isn't doing you any harm. Give me some of your chips. I gave you some of mine. That's not fair." We hear things like this every day from educated and uneducated people, adults and children alike. What's interesting, however, is not just that the one person is saying the other's behavior doesn't appeal to him, but that there's a standard behavior that the other person should know about. The other man rarely replies, "To hell with your standard." He usually tries to explain that his behavior did not go against the standard, and if it did, that it was for a good excuse. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. Otherwise, they would just fight like animals. Quarreling is reserved for humans, and it means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong. There would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had an agreement as to what right and wrong are. Just as there would be no sense in saying that a football player had committed a foul, unless there was some agreement about the rules of football. C.S. Lewis explains that this law or rule about right and wrong used to be called the law of nature. Nowadays, we speak of the laws of nature, and by those we usually mean things like gravitation or laws of chemistry and physics. However, when old thinkers spoke of the law of nature, what they were really speaking about was the law of human nature. The big difference between this law and the current laws of nature is that a person couldn't choose whether or not to obey the laws of gravitation or biology, but he could choose to disobey the law of nature. If you leave an unsupported body in midair, it has no choice about falling any more than a stone does. Each of them will come straight down. In other words, man does not have a choice about obeying the laws he shares with other organisms. But the one law that is only particular to him as a human, the law of nature, he does have a choice about whether or not to obey it. People thought that this law of nature was known by nature by everyone and doesn't need to be taught. This must be true because otherwise we wouldn't be able to agree, for example, that what the Nazis did was wrong, unless there were an absolute right and wrong. Now, some people say that this universal idea of right and wrong cannot exist because different civilizations of different ages have had different ideas of morality. This is simply not true. If you examine the civilizations of the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, and Romans, you'll find that they are very much similar to each other and to our own society today. You'll never find a society in which selfish is praised. Now, some societies may differ on who you should be unselfish to, only family, friends, or everyone, but everyone agrees that putting yourself first is not praiseworthy. People have differed on whether a man should have one wife or four, but they all agree that you shouldn't just have any woman you desired. The funny thing is this: if a man says he doesn't believe in an absolute right and wrong, you will find this same man contradicting this moments later. He may break his promise to you, but if you break your promise to him, he will say, "It's not fair," quicker than you can imagine. A nation may say that treaties don't matter, but then next minute they spoil their case by saying that the treaty they want to break was an unfair one. But if treaties do matter, if there is no such thing as right and wrong, in other words, if there is no law of nature, what is the difference between a fair treaty and an unfair one? It seems then that we're all operating under the law of right and wrong, whether we like it or not. It's not a matter of taste or opinion any more than the multiplication table is. Now that we've established this, let's move on to another point. None of us are really keeping the law of nature. At some point, we can all admit that we did not practice the behavior that we expect from others. We come up with all kinds of excuses. That time you were so unfair to the children was when you were very tired. That slightly shady business about the money came when you were very hard up. And what you promised you would do for so-and-so and never did? Well, You never would have promised if you had known how unbelievably busy you were going to be, and so on. This is to say that I fail at keeping the law of nature, but the moment someone points it out, a long list of excuses comes up. It's not a matter of whether or not they are good excuses. The point is that they are more proof of how strongly we believe in the law of nature. If we don't believe in decent behavior, why do we get so anxious to make excuses for not having behaved decently? The truth is, we believe in decency so much, we feel the rule or law pressing in on us, that we can't bear the fact that we're breaking it, so we try to shift responsibility. Now let's move on to a different point of contention. Some may argue that the law of nature is a herd instinct that has been developed like all our other instincts. This, however, is not true. We all know what it feels like to be prompted by instinct, by a mother's love or sexual instinct or the instinct for food. It means that you feel a strong want or desire to act in a certain way. Of course, we sometimes do feel that sort of desire to help another person, and no doubt that desire is due to the herd instinct. But feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you should help, whether you want to or not. Let's say you hear a man crying out in danger. You probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help, due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger, due to the instinct for self-preservation. But what you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, is a third thing, which tells you that you should follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say that the sheet of music, which tells you to play one note on the piano and not another, is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. Here's another way of seeing that the moral law is not simply one of our instincts. If two instincts are in conflict, and there's nothing in a man's mind except those two instincts, obviously the stronger of the two must win. But in those moments when we are most conscious of the moral law, it usually seems to be telling us to side with the weaker of the two impulses. You probably want to be safe much more than you want to help the man who's drowning, but the moral law tells you to help him more importantly. And it often tells us to try to make the right impulse stronger than it naturally is, right? We often feel it's our duty to stimulate the herd instinct by waking up our imaginations and arousing our pity and so on, so as to get up enough steam to do the right thing. But clearly, we're not acting from instinct when we try to make an instinct stronger than it is. The thing that says to you, your herd instinct is asleep, wake it up, cannot itself be the herd instinct. C.S. Lewis makes another point, stating that some others may argue, saying, isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention? Something that's put into us by education. There is a misunderstanding here. The people who ask that question are usually taking it for granted, that if we've learned something from parents and teachers, then that thing must merely be a human invention. But of course, that's not so. We all learn the multiplication table at school. A child who grew up alone on a desert island would not know it. But surely that does not mean that the multiplication table is simply a human convention, something human beings have made up for themselves and might have made different if they had liked. I fully agree that we learn the rule of decent behavior from parents and teachers and friends and books, as we learn everything else. But some of the things we learn are mere conventions which might have been different. For example, we learn to keep to the left of the road, but it might as well just have been keep to the right, and others of them, like mathematics, are real truths. The law of human nature is more like mathematics. Here's why. We all believe that some moralities are better than others. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understood morality better than their neighbors did. Very well then. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. This standard is the unchanged truth, like mathematics. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas got nearer to that right than others. In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nature had ever been more correct in its approval than any other. No sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse.